Perfect. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Hannah Harley. I'm the site supervisor here at Southern Alleghany's Museum of Art in Altoona. We are doing this artist lecture series as part of a education information about the exhibition we have going on. We have an exhibition called The Implications of the Camera that's looking at three different things that have happened around photography. So we have the dawn of photography, which looks at photography in the 1900s, the turn of the century and what was going on then in art photography. And then we have a new era where we look at photography from contemporary artists, and which is also sculpture, installation, fabric art that uses elements of photography in the practice. And then in our third gallery, we have a whole kind of printmaking exhibition, which looks into how photography and replication played a big role in pop art in the 1960s and 70s. So about our artist today, we have Chris McGinnis, who is an artist, curator, and educator currently working in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He has exhibited extensively, both nationally and internationally, with over 10 solo exhibitions and over 40 group exhibitions in recent years. Chris has created projects for the Westmoreland Museum of American Art, Urban Institute of Contemporary Art, the Pittsburgh Center for Arts, and the Rivers of Steel Heritage Corporation. He is co-founder of Alloy Pittsburgh, which is a site-based art project and research laboratory developed for the Carey Furnaces National Historic Landmark. His work has been published in the National Studio Visit magazine, Europe Art magazine, Manifest's International Printing Annual, as well as numerous local and university publications, including Pittsburgh's Post-Gazette and the Tribune Review. Chris has worked for institutions across the country, including Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Arizona, and Indiana University of Pennsylvania, where he served as director of the university's Kipp Gallery from 2011 to 2016. He is currently the founding director and chief curator for Rivers of Steel Arts, and which is a division of the Rivers of Steel Heritage Area. There we go. So we've done our official welcome then of Chris. Chris, if you want to take it away, I'm going to make you co-host so you can share to your heart's content information about your work. We are so excited, and welcome, Chris.
Thank you. That sounds great. Let me know whenever I have the ability to share. It's nice hearing somebody else read through the bio and not be able to pronounce some of the things in there that I always mess up when I'm reading it. So. Am I good to share now?
You are good to share. Go for it.
All right. Let's see if this works out. Okay. How's that look on everybody's screen? Good. Okay. Thank you, Hannah. I'm excited to be here. It's great to be able to talk a little bit about my work, specifically this project that I'm going to talk about today, and to have joined the great exhibition of so many different artists that you've pulled together. I recognize a handful of names when I came to visit, and it was just a real pleasure to see their work and then to be able to kind of bring some of my own context into the conversation. And so I'll just kind of start off with a little bit of a talk about my general practice and sort of what inspires me as an artist. I've been interested in kind of America's industrial landscape and heritage for quite some time. It's kind of been the underpinning of my work for a decade or more for now, and really dialing in on this endless pursuit of technology, efficiency, need for economic growth, and the implications that often go along with that. I tend to, try to bring visual or make visual that drive to progress and its effects on various facets of society, from entertainment culture to mechanization to the political sphere and community and economic development, and how all those things sort of swirl together. And so I kind of work with iconography that represents abundance and promise, and oftentimes in my paintings, things that kind of get at notions of American exceptionalism or the idea of that concept, and how it has influenced our identity as a country over the years and has manifested itself in a number of different ways. So a lot of times drawing from the large scale built environment. And so I've just before jumping into the project that Hannah has curated into this specific exhibition, it's worth mentioning that I'm not a photographer. I would never mention myself as such, but I tend to rely on photography a lot, and I'm inspired by various periods of photography history, and they tend to kind of jump out in my work as inspiration, a lot of times relating to the role of equipment, mechanization, and kind of machine execution of artwork, or that interface between the human and the machine. So, you know, I actually am probably more of a painter than anything, although my work, as you'll see later, you know, kind of goes from painting to photography to sculpture to installation, and obviously involved in the kind of administrative side of the art world, as well as a curator and a director. But the inspiration that drives the work across all of those spheres of my practice tend to kind of be connected together. So on the left, top left, is a painting from a series of paintings I did called the Arroyo Project, which looked at logging and timber industries in the Elk County, Pennsylvania territory, and how it impacted the landscape, transformed itself into recreational tourism in the new era, and has kind of contributed to this really interesting conflation of what would otherwise be conflicted elements of that experience. Top right was an installation that I did in partnership with some local poets and performance artists, and where we were kind of thinking about similar relationships between the human and the built environment. In this case, specifically mining, and the impact on communities that have relied on that over the years, and how it also kind of has influenced and impacted the people that work there in the mines specifically. Bottom left is an image from an ongoing project of mostly paintings that I work on called the Productive Machine, which is very much in line with everything I had already described about the relationships of industry and technology and entertainment culture, and kind of this drive towards the need to be creating and making constantly and improving. And then the bottom right is the Greenhouse Project, which is what we're going to talk about more today. As Hannah mentioned, I also am an arts administrator, and briefly mentioning the Rivers of Steel program, I was fortunate enough to found and build with the organization Rivers of Steel Heritage Corporation. And this program has a metal arts casting program in it. It has a graffiti arts wing, as well as some more contemporary arts, and a number of different events and public programs that we do in the community to celebrate and preserve the history of the cultures in southwestern Pennsylvania that we represent, and be able to connect those to the story of areas like the Mon Valley, Monongahela River Valley, which have historically been tied to this industrial growth and decline ultimately, and have really become a part of my story, both as a professional in this realm and the arts kind of management end of things, but also as an individual artist. I came to Pittsburgh in 2010, and I didn't really have any reason for coming here aside from my wife and I were looking for a place that could be, you know, small enough but have access to a lot of different university potentials. At the time I was teaching at the time, so I was looking for that access, but also the deep history of Pittsburgh from an industrial perspective was really interested, or I was very interested in the possibilities that I could have for expanding my work and the research that I had been doing for, you know, years up to that point in time. So whenever I came to the city, I started getting involved with various organizations, one of which is the organization I work for now, and was able to discover places like the Cary Blast Furnaces. Again, currently this is the location that I work out of, but whenever I first came to the city, this was essentially an abandoned mill with not much access. My first time going to it was sneaking under the fence like most other people did at the time, and just kind of exploring in the middle of winter. But learning about this site and its important role in the local heritage history from industrial and cultural perspective, and then also the organization connected to it, Rivers of Steel, has and did have then an extensive archives of the various industrial mills locally, the communities that worked those mills, and the cultures that they brought with them. So it provided this really rich opportunity for me to continue my research, which is exactly what happened. And it led me towards wanting to focus on something that kind of directly connected to some of the communities in the area that I was recognizing as examples of this type of industrial and economic fallout. So specifically, the Monongahela River Valley became very important. That's where the Carey furnace is located. It was once called the workshop of the world, or something along those lines, that I can, if I'm remembering it, but essentially, you know, was a network of industrial enterprises that stretched the entire way to West Virginia and beyond up the Mon River. And it's been decimated with the collapse of steel and the move away from heavy industrial technologies and economies. So, you know, these communities are faced, and have been for quite some time, with the need to reimagine themselves and what that looks like. And the story that was embedded in that, the challenges, the heartbreak, and the difficulties that these communities experienced, became the underpinning for the Greenhouse Project, which is the exhibition, a derivative of, that Hannah has brought into this exhibition, or the exhibition at the Southern Alleghenies Museum. So around this time that I had come to the city, I was also reading a lot of Rebecca Solnit. As I mentioned, I had been really inspired by photography from a historical standpoint, and as it relates to technology. But I also became really interested in the frontier photographers and their role in developing kind of how we understand and how we look at the West, how we interpret that as a country, and both how it contributes to these notions of American exceptionalism, but also reveals some of the more difficult challenges about Western expansion and human growth. So she had written a book, which I would recommend to anybody, called River of Shadows, which really looks and chronicles the work of Edward Muybridge as it leads up to and the relationship to the motion picture. But in that book, she also kind of mentions in passing once or twice the idea of how many glass plate and albumen prints from the late 19th century and the Civil War period had been lost to time and history because of a practice where people were reutilizing these images as glass plates, windows in greenhouses. And the reason they were doing that is twofold, but one, of course, was that glass was very valuable and hard to make at the time. So the notion of throwing something away was just not, they would reuse it before they threw it away. But more importantly, the content, the imagery that was on the vast majority of these albumen plates were images from the Civil War that were really difficult for everyone in the country to confront and to deal with. So nobody really wanted them, which is kind of hard to imagine now, thinking back, that you wouldn't want something like that, even if they were difficult to look at. But so they ended up getting, repurposed in a number of different ways. And one of those ways was in the greenhouse windows. And this really interested me because I was of what happens to the images, and then the notion of what happens in a greenhouse. So, by bringing these images into the windows and allowing them to be exposed to that degree of sunlight over time, of course, they deteriorated and the images began to die away on the plates. However, it began to give life to all of the plants that were growing inside. So there was this really interesting metaphor and beautiful kind of scenario happening where the imagery of at that point in time, the most tragic and costly war in American history, and arguably the modern era at that point in time, were being used to regrow life inside. So I wanted to use that as a way to kind of have a conversation about what was taking place in Mon Valley communities. And in a similar way to how kind of Mark Dion was looking at the kind of conflation of science, technology, experience, art, and nature and life, essentially, in his Nucum Vivarium installation, I wanted to kind of take a same way of thinking about the communities in Braddock and Homestead. It specifically was where I ended up shooting a lot of the photos. So this project contains about 70, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, photographs taken from both my own tours of the communities of Braddock and Homestead in southwestern Pennsylvania, as well as historical images that came from mills and in town of those same communities throughout history. And I used them to create silkscreen plexiglass windows across an entire facade of images. And behind that, I wanted to develop it's sort of like a micro industrial landscape similar to what you might find at the Cary furnaces or in some of these other industrial locations, and then be able to grow essentially plants, specifically poplar trees is what I'm sorry, I didn't want to go there yet. Poplar trees in this facade. So I had gathered poplar saplings, and I was interested in poplar trees because of their kind of determination as a species. They grow across the entire United States and in some really crazy locations, one of which in particular is on top of the Cary blast furnaces, or at least was for that matter when I first got involved. About 100 feet off the ground, there was a 16-foot poplar tree growing on the top of the furnace. So this kind of ability to thrive and exist in really difficult and challenging environments became another kind of extension of that metaphor. So that became the basis for the start of the greenhouse project. And this was installed at the Pittsburgh Center for the Arts. And then it kind of went to some other locations after that, which I'll talk to a little bit about those now. So, and Hannah, how am I doing on time? Wait.
You're doing great. You can, expand and expand.
Oh, don't say that. Good. So whenever I developed the concept for the greenhouse project, I really wanted it to change the insides of what was contained inside the greenhouse ideally changes with each location. And this has been sometimes more successful than others throughout the project, as is often the case. But in this specific iteration, which was the second one, greenhouse stalagmites, I had the opportunity to further develop a relationship between this project and the history of photography. In this case, a more recent history. It turned out, this went on display at the Urban Institute for Contemporary Art in Grand Rapids. And when I was building this next iteration of it, I was really interested in the continued kind of fallout of new photography media and the changes brought about by digitization in that technology. So I was just kind of doing some basic research for what I might want to, an exploration for what I might want to pursue. And I stumbled across a whole collection store of these 35 millimeter slides at a local organization in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Center for Creative Reuse, which essentially is they collect things that would otherwise find the landfill, and they work with schools and local artists and community organizations and anybody who wants to come in to repurpose them, and have things available like crazy, different types of little bits of fabric that come from places like Joann Fabric that they would otherwise be thrown away, but people will come in and pick through things and use them for creative processes. Well, they just happen to have been donated all of the slide collection from the art and architectural history programs at Carnegie Mellon University. So Carnegie Mellon had digitized their entire collection of hundreds of thousands of slides, and they just dumped gaylords of these slides off at the Pittsburgh Center for Creative Reuse. And I don't know if anybody knows what a gaylord is, but essentially it's a 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot cube that is full. It's a big, garbage can that big essentially. And it was just filled to the brim, and there were multiples of these that were filled with all the slides that came out of their collection. So I thought, wow, what an incredible material to be able to use in a conversation about the history of photography, but in this case also the history of art and architecture and how we consume and understand that history. And so it led me to thinking about, well, how would this find its way into the greenhouse project? What conversation might be, relevant there? So I started kind of moving towards this idea of repurposing today's obsolete visual technology and comparing the eclipse of the 35 millimeter slide which had proven fragile in the face of this rapid digitization, with a similar abandonment of glass negatives late in the 19th century, where there was a tectonic shift in technology. And in addition to what was I had mentioned earlier, the difficulty with the types of images themselves, the move away from things like wet collodion and albumin prints towards silver gelatin and more effective technologies, I felt was a really interesting conversation to also point towards. And the fragility of the in this case the 35 millimeter slides, from the perspective of technology, the fragility is as kind of a metaphor represented through the stalagmite too, which stalagmites, like thousands of years old essentially, and their crystal surfaces are incredibly fragile. So once you expose them to the air that is otherwise was in that cavern for eons, they begin to break down and deteriorate really quickly. So these, again, thinking about how those two things overlap metaphorically, and they are understood through that sense of fragility. So this has thousands of slides inside of it, and I've got some other images that essentially form what I was trying to kind of create stalagmites growing up off the floor of the inside of the greenhouse. So you look through the image and then you see these growing kind of pillars of slides, each of them, coming from that same collection and representing a little piece of our own cultural history. So there's just some other slides that look at how it was set up. And, in large part, this was also kind of a destructive process, it was definitely a destructive process for the medium itself. So in the slides that I ended up using, in many cases this was sort of their last hurrah, because you had to destroy them in order to get them to kind of stack together like this, and using glues and adhesives and things stuck through the middle of them to kind of give that sense of it rising. And there was an interesting conversation there in the process of destroying that history and that culture, which I hated to be the one to have to do, but it was already on its way by being kind of given away from the collection. But and I wanted to have a conversation about what should or can be done with these staggering physical remains, of including and beyond the 35 millimeter slide conversation, but just around obsolete 20th century visual technology, obsolete technology in general, and show, like, again, pointing back to that conversation about the albumin and collodion glass plates and how they were repurposed at the time into something useful that ultimately, in this case and others, I'm sure, became inspiration for future creative energy and excitement. What can be done with the things that we're using and reusing and then getting rid of now, to have them have a new life or continue in some sort of meaningful way other than hitting a landfill. So I have a couple more detailed shots of this installation. And then, of course, now at the Southern Alleghenies Museum, the greenhouse facade is up when you walk in the main entrance to that building. And I like this iteration of it for a number of different reasons. Proximity to some of the photo collections there, I think, created another level of interesting conversation when you're seeing a light projected onto something else and being able to capture those images pointing back directly to the original purpose of the glass plates in general, but also kind of tying into the history of Altoona from a steelmaking and industrial perspective, and that conversation again about transforming and reimagining communities and how we can utilize that history and that story to help chart a path forward and of rebirth. I'm not exactly sure which one's the last one here. So, well, that's the last one. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? I guess I should come out of the share, right?
Yeah, that'd be great. All right, so thank you so much, Chris. If you do get a chance to visit the Altoona Museum, you'll be able to see the installation of that right when you walk in. It's in the lobby, and it provides such an exciting way to be welcomed into the show. And we'll be sharing that on our social media so you can see it, but it's really exciting if you get to come on down. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, or feel free to say them out loud. Chris, I have a couple questions for you. So what are you kind of working on now or moving in towards as you look at, 2020 has kind of changed everybody's artistic practices. What are you exploring now?
That's a great question, and you're exactly right. It's had a real impact. Well, I think big and small things. From a larger sort of practical standpoint, I have a new studio space now that I haven't had in years past, with a lot more space available. So I'm thinking about scale, which is something I'm not always able to do. I mean, the greenhouse, of course, is a large piece, but it, as Hannah knows, breaks down very nicely into smaller boxes that become stacked. So, I've been working out of small spaces up to this point. So scale has been something I've been really interested in expanding. I'm pretty much dialed into a painting series right now. Although, again, as my practice would have it, it has a very strong link to photography. So dipping back into the one series that I was working on called The Productive Machine, and working on that in more of a contemporary way, thinking about how to expand this conversation or this use of like light painting in the early 20th century to map human movement, and how that became kind of a way of understanding and plotting human efficiency, and being able to understand how quickly or best a product could be made on an assembly line by watching the map of a light painted worker that was created when they were making that thing. That's where a lot of my initial inspiration for that project started, with like the Frank and Lillian Gilbreth's Taylorism and how photography was used in that capacity then. But now I'm looking more at, from a performative standpoint, recreating these kind of experiences in former places of production, and creating new light painting motions and forms and shapes that can be integrated back into the paintings to diversify the types of imagery and color that I can work with, but also create a conversation that moves past this period of when it was strictly talking about historical scientific management, and being able to use that in an industrial capacity, but thinking about it solely from an artistic perspective. And actually talking with one of the other artists in this show, Lori Hepner, about partnering with her on a series of these that would kind of visit locations and take some site-based, site-specific light painting captures that I will then integrate back into a new series of paintings, which I also like, because there's this strange notion of redundancy and of painting a light painting, kind of bringing the photo back into the painting in a more laborious and less practical way to paint it back in. So that kind of redundancy and futility is really something that I find really interesting as well. So that's kind of where I'm headed from a creative practice in the near term within my own work, and I'm just ready to kind of get the wheels turning on that and get moving.
Thank you so much. Now I know you're here as an artist, and your artwork is, I'm thrilled to have it here. It's beautiful to see in person. But you also have done a ton of work with the Carey Furnace and with your projects there. And I know, since some of these folks are coming from the kind of Altoona area, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share some of that project and programming and what you've been able to see over the few years that you've been doing that.
Absolutely. And it's no problem to ask about that, because frankly, my entire creative career, for one reason or another, has ended up coalescing around this body of what was originally my research interests that led me on a studio practice that have now become also a governing aspect of my entire professional career. And I definitely did not anticipate that happening. But so as I had mentioned earlier, when I came to the city, I ended up working with Rivers of Steel as an independent artist in their archives. And that led me to create not only my own works. I ended up partnering with a colleague of mine who's the sculpture professor at IUP, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, on a program called Alloy Pittsburgh, which was essentially a contemporary site-based sculpture program that we developed while both of us were professors at IUP to bring local artists into the Carey Furnaces and provide them an opportunity to develop large-scale site-based exhibitions and kind of push their careers in a way that they might not have been able to before, and without having things the need to be permanent. They could explore in a temporary manner and help, again, contribute to reimagining what the potential for this place could be in the future. And also, as importantly, go through an intense period of research, learning about why this place is important. Why did, so many people dedicate their lives to preserving this and not letting it be torn down in the 80s? Why were laborers and former workers focused and interested in staying involved in that conversation and coming back now to give tours? So being able to open them up to this greater, broader context and allow that to be a fuel for the creative process. And that project went off quite well, and it started a new conversation that Sean and I ended up having around the need or the potential for a comprehensive arts program at the Carey Furnaces. So at that time, there were some other things taking place. One of my colleagues, who's now our graffiti arts curator, was also in conversations with the organization about the collection of graffiti murals that were on site from throughout the past 25, 30 years, and some new ones as well. And the potential for these to kind of be a contributing factor to the history, an important part of the post-industrial legacy of that site. And there was also some other metal arts work happening at the same time by some outside organizations and groups that were interested in the site from the perspective of its iron making history. So we got together, Sean and I, and embarked on essentially a 1.5 year long program development period where we visited various other like-minded organizations in the region and nearby states, built models based on how they had successfully integrated history with new growth and ideas for the future. And also took what these other assets that were already starting to germinate, like the metal arts and the graffiti arts, and integrate them into a whole so that they become an extension and a contributing factor to that interpretation.
Someone is unmuted. We're gonna mute you.
That's okay. I'm surprised that's the first time. It's been a great group for that.
I know. Normally they're pretty chatty, but nice job, everybody. You're good at Zoom.
Yep. So we wanted to create a program that brought all these elements together and to support the interpretation of the site from a historical and a heritage preservation perspective. And that ultimately ended up becoming Rivers of Steel Arts, the organization that I run now. So as we launched that program, officially launched it in the public facing in 2016, and it began to grow to a degree where I kind of pulled back from my work in academia and left being a teacher to take on this role as the director and chief curator for the organization more officially and full time. And that's really allowed us to blossom a lot of these programs in the community in ways that I don't think I was even really prepared for the amount of growth that would happen over those 4 years. So we do graffiti arts programming, again, that really focuses on the post-industrial period of the Carey Furnaces and the region as well. And it's a form of advocacy for the art of graffiti as a valid and important form of urban vernacular, as a creative experience that can be a contribution to public spaces in a positive way, as opposed to only a form of vandalism. So Shane, our graffiti curator, does a number of different programs in schools locally in Pittsburgh, and as well as the community and mural programs and public painting projects, and just general advocacy work, trying to get the word out about potential legal walls, creating places for people to work where they don't have to fear the retribution of being arrested by the police or prosecuted. And a lot of this came for that program from the reality of what we found at Carey Furnaces, was that the artists, the guerrilla artists, graffiti artists, urban explorers, they were coming into the site for years. And even after the site became, quote unquote, protected, they still came in, and you had the entire range of people. You had people coming in and doing massive, beautiful murals there because nobody was, really able to kind of get to them. But then you had people coming in and creating really quick tag not necessarily, productive graffiti pieces on various places too. So by developing this formal program of welcoming people into the site, it allowed us to channel that energy in a positive way, to where we said, don't come through the back door, essentially come through the front door. We'll give you a space to work, and we'll give you 5 hours to paint something magnificent, so that what you leave is better for your career, and it's better for our site. And it importantly allows us to focus those murals in places where they can legally be there. So the Carey Furnaces is a National Historic Landmark. So by virtue of its affiliation with the National Park System, there are certain parts of the site that we're able to create these murals on, and certain parts that we're not, that are protected under that landmark status. So when the graffiti writers were coming in on their own, they didn't know the difference and didn't care, or they were just painting wherever because it was there. Now we were able to engage them in a professional way up front, and point them towards areas that, we could keep the murals and didn't have to paint over them or scrub them off after. So that's kind of how that program developed into what it's become, with workshops and school groups and et cetera. And the Metal Arts program similarly, but more directly, draws on the history of that site as an iron making blast furnace. So we do metal arts workshops and programs throughout the year. People can come and learn how to cast iron and aluminum. You can workshops everything up from essentially what we call doodle bowl workshops, which are kind of like paint parties for metal art people, where you come and social hour, and you get to carve into a pre-made sand mold, and that is a bowl mold, and carve whatever design you want into it. And then we'll cast it right there in aluminum, and you can take it home with you, and you have an aluminum cast bowl, and you also had, a nice few hours of fun with your friends. And then we have week-long workshops where people develop, multi-thousand pound sculptures that they cast with us on site, that go to various places throughout the country. So there's obviously direct lineal connections between that program and the legacy of the Carey Furnaces site as well, but also more importantly, the region more broadly in the Mon Valley area, which has kind of become our de facto target area. We were developing individual programs, I started working much more closely with communities around the region, and developed an initiative that now governs sort of the whole art program, which is called the Mon Valley Creative Corridor. And this program is specifically intended to help communities in the Mon Valley leverage their unique assets, cultural assets, to bring people back, whether it's for an afternoon to, come eat at a restaurant, or hopefully down the line to develop enough energy around their cultural uniqueness and current existing assets to build momentum for people to see these communities as something other than failed post-industrial shells. A lot of them they have really beautiful downtowns. They're small, quaint, like quintessential American towns. They're just located in a place that did not benefit from the shift away from heavy industry. So how do we, take that charm? How do we take those unique assets and make them an asset, frankly, an asset more recognizable and understood by communities around the area. So, at the Carey Furnaces is the nucleus of all of this. So we do events, festivals, drive-ins. This past year, large exhibitions of contemporary and historic art. We have a large collection of regional art in the organization as well. We kind of work with folks ranging from folk and traditional artists, because we're also one of the we're region 14 for the PA Council on the Arts. Folk Arts Center. So we actually represent a few counties in southwestern Pennsylvania for folk and traditional arts. So we work with those artists. We work with contemporary metal artists. We work with historic blacksmiths and performance artists that are working today, and light-based engineers. So it's kind of across the board, but people from a range of different perspectives seem to find inspiration in this place, the Carey Furnaces, and thankfully the organization, myself included, but certainly, the vision was before me, that they recognized that potential, and that there was meaning in so many different facets of this site and how people come to it, whether it's from community development, industrial engineering, landscape preservation, historical preservation, and education and STEM-based learning. You come to this place from so many different angles, but you find equal meaning in it. And that's one of the real special things about it.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was very informative, and I'm sure it's a lot to try to condense that into as much as you've got going on there. So we do have a question here from Jenna. Thank you, Jenna. She says, I love your greenhouse stalagmites project. I find the installation and scale of it fascinating and wish I could see it in person. Can you share a little bit about how you envision your audience interacting with this work? And if you also want to talk a little bit about its new installation here at the museum and how we've kind of seen some difference with the audience and how interactions happen. So you want to take
Absolutely. Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you. I'm glad you enjoy it. So the interaction part of it's not necessarily a thing you can walk into. In the stalagmites version of it, there was a potential for that at one point in time, but because the space became a little bit too dense in there, it ended up becoming something that you interact with from the outside. And the hope is that, again, like you're looking through these images, you can move them and tilt them, and kind of make them forward or backwards. Light passes through them, and in some cases, depending on how that's cast, can cast a shadow or a projection of the image on the outside to the inside. And thinking about the relationships between those two things, what do you do with a 35 millimeter slide? At least what I did with them as soon as I got them, I held it up to my eye and started looking through it, and because they're really cool. In fact, my kids, I used to have a stack of them here that I just kept because my kids, they had no idea what that was, and they'll never see it again probably, but they enjoyed just being able to look through and see the little images in each one of them. So in a similar way, you're kind of approaching it, and you can look through the greenhouse windows into the inside in a mirror of sorts of the way that you look through the 35 millimeter slide. Really, everything in the exhibition was intended to draw connections in that manner, like between the material on the inside, the context in which it exists, the greenhouse, the metaphorical relationship and that it was inspired from, and try to think about how all of these things come together. And hopefully maybe it makes you think about the sheer scale of how many slides were in there and how much more there is in the world of that sort of thing and everything else. And so, it kind of opens up that bit of a conversation. And in the current iteration of it, it became much more about the actual windows themselves, and in a way that I haven't shown yet. So I think context in the location of the town is also really important in this iteration, where it hasn't necessarily been important to some of the others. So the stalagmites installation went into Grand Rapids, where there is a really interesting and wonderful story of furniture making in Grand Rapids throughout history, but that didn't manifest in the content of that exhibition. So there wasn't necessarily a local clear connection there. But the thing I like about its current location, while there's no, inside material to look at, if you will, Hannah, clearly recognized, as I do, that the relationship between the content and inspiration for this installation in the first place was directly tied to some of the same challenges, the same history and context that exists in Altoona, and how that area has grown over the years, and what's been lost in some cases, and what the potential is. So my hope is more of it's understood in its current state as building off of the past iterations of the project, and thinking about it local to Altoona and what that might mean.
Thank you. And I think it's also that we're in an old department store here. So there's so much glass. Like when you walk in, it was very much about the presentation. And so what's really fun is when you're coming up the stairs from one of the galleries, you get a lot of reflections, you get a lot of interaction, and you get to see through it into the street. You get to see through it and see artwork. And it has this really fun quality to it. And you can get up close and see the screen printing on it. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's actually, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's probably the most, in that way, from a material standpoint and visual experience, the most dynamic place it's ever been, because you have all these other things angles by which you can experience it. I mean, the original exhibition in the Center for the Arts was really great for doing what it was intended to do. You know, you had the layout behind it, you looked through and you experienced it that way, but it was a flat facade. There was no getting around on both sides of it, no seeing something else through it, because it was essentially a white wall aside from the materials on the ground. And similar in the Grand Rapids iteration, but this time you really do, because it is set up in front of those windows and the stairs go down behind it and you have artworks hung behind it. You have the light that catches the stained glass window sometimes on the front and can, you know, come down into that space as well. There are just a number of different ways to really engage with it visually, and it's by far the most dynamic.
Well, thank you, Chris. If there are no more questions, I'd just like to share real quick what's going to be happening here at SAMA. Next week, we're doing photography, color, and sound with April Fridges and Heather Brand. They're two of the artists in this exhibition, and that'll be February 1st at 12:30 p.m. And a reminder that your financial support helps keep our doors open for free. So SAMA is very involved in all sorts of programming, and our doors are open to the public for free Tuesday through Saturday. So please consider donating to Southern Alleghenies Museum of Art. And this exhibition is on view at SAMA Altoona, and we want to thank our sponsors, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Struber and Rocket Fuel Studios. And we do have an exciting announcement. You may have seen it, but our last talk will end with on February 8th, and we are going to be talking to Jessica Beck, who is the Milton Fine art curator at the Warhol, and she's going to be talking a little bit about how replication played a role in pop art and silkscreen printing, and how that really made the explosion of art in the 60s and 70s, which ties into our last exhibition gallery. So we want to thank you all so much for coming. We want to thank you, Chris, especially for sharing all of your information and about your work, and for letting us have this incredible installation here in Altoona. We are so grateful for it and are so thrilled that we were able to spend the Monday lunch hour with everybody here today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.